Welcome, my friend. You didn't just stumble here by chance. This is the place where truths cut through noise, where love is stripped of illusions, and where you finally hear the words your heart has been waiting for. Here, we speak about the things no one dares to say about attraction, respect, connection, and the deep, unshakable confidence that makes life magnetic. This isn't empty motivation. This is raw clarity, forged in experience and told with the honesty you deserve. Every video is a step deeper into understanding people, relationships, and yourself. If you're tired of pretending, tired of shallow answers, and ready for something real, stay, because once you hear what's coming, you'll never look at love, respect, or life the same way again. It happened in an instant, and yet it felt like it had been years in the making. That first glance wasn't just a passing moment in a crowded room. It was a collision, a quiet explosion between two worlds that had been circling each other without even knowing it. There was no smile, no polite nod, just eyes locking in a way that felt almost dangerous. Heat surged, yes, but it was more than that. There was recognition, a sense of knowing that went deeper than logic could explain. It was as if some unspoken truth had been waiting for this exact moment to make itself known. Everything around faded into a blur. The voices, the music, the subtle hum of life carrying on, as though nothing monumental was happening. But inside, the air thickened. Time slowed to the kind of pace where each heartbeat became loud enough to hear. That gaze held more than attraction. It held inevitability, as though every choice made before this moment had been guiding the path toward it. There was no introduction, no exchange of names, not yet. The body didn't need those things to understand. The mind might still have been forming the shape of his face, memorizing the curve of his mouth, the depth of his eyes, but something older, something primal already knew. That knowing came with a weight, a warning almost, but one that begged to be ignored, because whatever this was, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't going to be something that could be tucked neatly away and forgotten. And so the eyes stayed locked, a second too long to be casual, too deliberate to be dismissed. That was when the first flicker of danger showed itself, not danger in the way of harm, but in the way of falling too fast, of losing ground. The kind of danger where one touch, one word, could shift everything into a place from which there would be no turning back. His eyes weren't simply looking, they were searching, as if in that moment he could raid every part that had been hidden from the world. There was no defense against it. The instinct to look away, to protect whatever boundaries existed before, didn't even come. Instead, there was the quiet surrender of letting it happen. Somewhere deep, there was the realization that this wasn't the kind of thing that people planned for. It was a force, not an option, an inevitability that would have found its way here no matter the circumstances. And in that realization was both fear and relief. Fear because it meant something precious was at stake, and relief because, perhaps for once, there would be no need to chase, no need to explain. That moment, those first few breaths, became the foundation for what would follow. It wasn't simply attraction. It was the beginning of being seen in a way that stripped away all pretenses. A seeing that was raw, unflinching, and without mercy. The kind of seeing that would demand the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient, even when it hurt. Later, there would be words, there would be conversations that spilled late into the night. There would be touches that burned their memory into the skin, and there would be moments of such quiet closeness it felt like breathing together. But none of that would have been possible without this, the first look, the one that carried an entire story inside it before a single word was spoken. It wasn't love yet, not in the way that people define it with promises and plans, but it was the seed of it, the raw, unshaped form of something that could grow wild and deep if given the chance. And maybe that's why the eyes didn't let go, why neither one of us turned away, because to break it would be to deny the truth that had already been set in motion. And in that moment, standing there, surrounded by people who were oblivious to what had just sparked into existence. There was a silent agreement, no words, just a shared certainty that something forbidden yet undeniable had taken root. And from that point forward, nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same. It began quietly, the way a flame first breathes in the dark before it grows into something that can no longer be ignored. There were no grand gestures at first, only the subtle pull that made the air shift whenever he entered the room. His presence was not loud or demanding, but it was impossible to escape. Every glance felt like it carried a weight, not the kind that drags a person down, but the kind that roots them to a moment they can't step away from. I would notice the smallest things, how his fingers lingered on the edge of a glass, the way his voice softened at the end of a sentence, how his eyes stayed just long enough to make me forget what I had been saying. It wasn't just attraction. Attraction is easy, it's surface level. This was deeper, slower, like water carving its way through stone over years. There was something in him that called to something in me I hadn't known was waiting to be found. It made every second in his presence feel stretched, drawn out, like the world was deliberately slowing to let me notice each detail. And I did. Every breath, every tilt of his head, every movement that seemed so unhurried yet deliberate. There's a kind of connection that doesn't shout, doesn't need to announce itself to the world. It moves in silence, in shared glances that carry more than spoken words ever could. That's how it was with him. We didn't have to touch for the air between us to hum with awareness. Sometimes it was in the smallest proximity, passing by each other in a hallway, brushing past in a doorway, that I felt it most. My skin would recognize him before my mind caught up, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was near. The night it shifted from something silent to something undeniable. I remember the room was dim, the kind of light that makes everything softer, more forgiving. We stood close enough that I could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing, close enough that the edge of his shirt brushed against my arm. There was a pause, long enough for both of us to know that stepping away would mean losing something we'd been building without even meaning to. He didn't rush. That was the most disarming part. There was no urgency, no forcing of the moment. He simply existed there, fully present, letting the space between us close in its own time. Every second felt like it was asking a question without words, and every second I found myself answering without speaking. My pulse wasn't racing. It was steady, certain, as if my body already understood that whatever happened next wasn't a mistake, but an inevitability. When his hand finally reached for mine, it wasn't a grab. It was a slow, deliberate finding, as though he'd been tracing the path to me for a long time and had finally arrived. The warmth of his skin spread through me in a way that felt like recognition rather than discovery, like we'd been here before in some place neither of us could name. And still, he didn't pull me closer, not yet. Instead, he let his thumb brush over my hand, slow and unhurried, his eyes never leaving mine. There was a quiet in that moment that wasn't empty. It was full, overflowing even, with the kind of truth that makes everything else seem unimportant. The hum of the world faded, and all that existed was the steady, magnetic pull between us, the kind that erases distance without moving a single step. When he did close the space, it wasn't a sudden collapse. It was like the tide reaching the shore, inevitable, gentle, and unstoppable all at once. His touch wasn't searching, it was knowing. Every movement was a statement, not a question. There was nothing rushed, nothing careless. It felt as though he was memorizing me, the way a person commits a favorite poem to heart, not to perform it, but to carry it inside themselves forever. The air around us grew heavier, richer, filled with something unspoken but certain. My skin felt alive, almost aching, not from want alone, but from the depth of being seen without any disguise. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking into me, past every carefully built wall, past every mask. And in that gaze was no judgment, no demand, only the quiet, steady truth of being wanted entirely. There was a moment, just before everything dissolved into touch, where I realized that this was not about surrendering to him, but about allowing myself to be where I already belonged. I didn't fall into him. I stepped into a place that had been waiting for me, as though every step in my life had been guiding me toward this exact point in time. And when his lips finally met mine, it wasn't a claim, it was an answer. An answer to every unspoken question, every moment of silent pull, every reason my heart had been leaning toward him long before my mind admitted it. The world didn't explode, it didn't have to. The real change wasn't loud, it was quiet, deep, and absolute. Even now, I know that what bound us in that moment wasn't just the physical closeness, but the undeniable truth that some connections are not built, they are found, and once found, they change everything. It began in the quiet between words, in the spaces where eyes held more weight than anything that could be spoken. The air felt charged, thick with a tension that wasn't sharp, but warm, like a slow, burning fire waiting for the moment it would fully catch. There was no rush, no clumsy push toward what might come next, just a slow unfolding, as if the world outside had ceased to matter, and everything that remained existed within that fragile, unbroken connection. When his hands finally found their way, it wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was as if he had been searching for something for years, and in that instant, he knew he'd found it. The first touch didn't just land on skin, it sank deeper, touching something that lived far beneath the surface. It was discovery, not possession, not the hunger of someone trying to take, but the reverence of someone who had finally arrived at a place worth staying. Every kiss came like a promise. They weren't frantic, they weren't careless. Each one carried the weight of intention, as though he wanted me to feel what he couldn't yet say. The slow press of his lips, the lingering pauses between them, it all felt like a language that was ours alone, spoken without sound. It was a claiming yes, but not in the way of ownership. It was as if he was saying, "This is where I belong. This is where I'll stay." Breath became something shared. The space between us narrowed until it no longer existed, and suddenly I couldn't tell whose inhale was whose. It was as if our bodies had decided for us that separation was no longer necessary. In those moments, the rhythm of his chest against mine felt like a tether pulling us into perfect alignment. There was no need to think, no need to direct or lead. It was all instinct, two currents meeting and becoming one. The warmth of his touch was steady, but it held a pulse, a subtle reminder that he was alive and real beneath it all. His fingertips traced paths they'd never known, yet moved as if they'd memorized them in another lifetime. The way they lingered, not out of hesitation, but out of wanting to remember, felt like a devotion that couldn't be feigned. The closeness deepened until time itself lost meaning. Minutes, hours, none of it mattered. What mattered was the silent conversation carried through touch, and the way our heartbeats began to mimic each other. The rhythm was hypnotic, like waves folding over one another, no longer separate but part of the same motion. And in that space, something shifted. It wasn't just desire, it was surrender, not the kind that comes from giving up, but the kind that comes from finally realizing you are safe enough to let go, safe enough to release every wall, every guarded part of yourself, because you know they will be met with the same care, the same depth, the same unshakable presence. There was no beginning anymore, no end, no boundary between where one ended and the other began. Just the quiet, unshakable truth that in this moment, nothing else could matter more. The world outside could wait. Here, inside this space, there was only the certainty that we had found something we weren't willing to lose. And so we stayed. The sunlight came gently, not as an intruder, but as something honest. It slipped across the floor, touched the curve of the sheets, warmed the air, and in that light, nothing felt like it had to hide. The night before didn't dissolve with sleep. It clung softly, in the air, in the quiet rhythm of breath, in the way the heart still carried its memory like a secret it didn't want to give away. It wasn't about possession or proof, but about a truth that could not be undone. The truth that sometimes a single night can carry more meaning than years of polite love. The hours had been slow, deep, and unhurried, each one heavy with the weight of being seen completely, not just touched, but understood in ways no conversation had ever reached. There was no mask, no pretending. The eyes that had looked across in the darkness had not just admired. They had studied, learned, memorized, and somewhere in the depth of those looks there had been an unspoken promise. The kind of promise that isn't made with words, but with the way someone holds you like they've been waiting their whole life to know what you feel like in their arms. It had been quiet but full, simple but impossible to forget. There were moments in that night when time itself had seemed reluctant to move forward, as if even it knew this was something worth stretching. The morning wasn't a cold return to reality. It was the opposite. It was proof. Every breath, every faint smile in that early light carried the awareness that nothing had been a mistake. There was no scramble to explain, no need to justify, only the calm ache of knowing something rare had happened. An ache that wasn't pain, but a reminder of closeness, of acceptance, of a depth that doesn't come often. Hands had spoken their own language through the night, asking questions without sound, answering without hesitation. Each touch wasn't just a touch. It was a revelation, a way of saying, I see you, I'm here, I'm not afraid of the truth you keep. And with each of those unspoken exchanges, a wall had crumbled, brick by brick, until there was nothing left between two people but raw, unfiltered presence. The air that morning still smelled faintly of skin, of warmth, of something untamed yet safe. Every shift beneath the sheets was slow, not because of exhaustion, but because there was no rush to leave that place. The world outside could wait. Everything worth having was already here. Eyes met again in that daylight, and they didn't flinch. There was no retreat in them, only the kind of softness that comes from knowing someone has looked at you without turning away from the parts you never show. The kind of softness that feels like a vow, not to stay forever, not to own, but to remember. And that's the thing about certain nights. They're not built to be repeated or recreated. They're built to live on, untouched, a memory polished by time, unspoiled by routine. They don't fade because they aren't just events. They are turning points. That morning was the quiet after a storm, the warmth after winter, the moment the heart realizes it has been changed, and there's no going back. The truth lingered in every breath taken before getting up. The truth that sometimes a single night is enough to show you what love is meant to feel like. Not the kind that begs for validation or follows rules, but the kind that feels whole even if it has no future. The kind that leaves you both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because you've been seen, heavier because you know how rare it is. The sunlight moved across the room slowly, as if it too wanted to stay. The skin still carried the ghost of every place a hand had rested. The heart still carried the weight of every glance, every pause, every wordless exchange. It didn't matter how the rest of the day unfolded, or how the story would continue, because some moments don't belong to time. They belong to the people who lived them, and they last as long as the memory chooses to stay. It wasn't the end. It wasn't the beginning. It was simply a night and a morning after that would never leave.